Welcome to ongoing election coverage by Town Meeting Television. This is one of 22 forums being brought to you in advance of the general election in November. All candidates on the ballot are invited to participate in Town Meeting TV election forums. These forums introduce you to community decision makers and connect you with issues that shape your local community. If you're watching this live, we welcome your questions at 802-862-3966. Watch Town Meeting TV on Comcast Channel 1087, Burlington Telecom Channels 17 and 217, as well as online at Town Meeting TV's YouTube page. So today I have with me Representatives Jessica Brumsted and Mike Yantachka, representing Shelburne and Charlotte, respectively. We're going to go through a series of questions. Candidates will have about a minute and a half to respond. And I'll start with opening statement. Please tell us why you are running and what experience you bring to the position. Let's start with you, Jessica.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Jessica Brumsted, and I represent Shelburne and St. George. I live in Shelburne. I just finished my second term, and in my first term, I served on the House Government Operations Committee. In my second term, I served on the House Human Services Committee. Before I ran for office, what brought me to run was I worked for then Congressman James M. Jeffords and then Senator Jeffords for 12 years, focused on childcare and healthcare issues. I learned from him the art of compromise and bringing everyone to the table, and I felt so I was there for 12 years, and then I went to work for Fletcher Allen, running a program called Health Choices, which was an educational program for the community to learn more about healthcare changes. And then I went to UVM and ran a program called AHAC, Area Health Education Centers, where we brought people in, providers, to practice in rural areas all over Vermont. And so after all of that, I took some time. My kids were in middle school. I have 4 children, and they needed someone to be there at the end of the day to make sure that they got to their sports and their music. And then I decided that I felt that it was time to, what was I going to be when I grew up? And I really wanted to get back in and help with the whole compromise and having more people involved. I felt that I went to vote and there were 6 senators, and there were only 6 I could choose 6. And so there wasn't really anyone else running. And I thought, well, maybe I should run. And I felt that I was qualified because of the work that I had done over the years. I also was on many budget committees as part of the school board and on an enrichment panel, and worked as a volunteer in the schools for a long time. So
Thank you.
That's what brought me. Thank you.
And Mike, tell us why you're running and the experience that you bring to the position.
Okay, so I've been in the legislature for 10 years. I represent Charlotte and a little corner of Heinsberg. I had more people in Heinsberg during my first run, which was prior to the 2010 census. So when redistricting happened, I wound up with only a small corner of Heinsberg in the southwest corner, bordering Charlotte and Moncton. So anyway, I've served for 10 years. First 6 years, I was on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And then that was reorganized. And now I'm on the Energy and Technology Committee, which was formed 4 years ago. So I call it the Geek Committee because we deal with energy, telecommunications, and the IT infrastructure of the state. Kind of fits my background because I was an information technology developer for over 36 years, last 24 at IBM. My reason for running, I believe in serving my community. I was in high school when John Kennedy, in his speech, said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And I've held that close to my heart ever since. I've tried to be involved in politics ever since my college days, one way or another, usually in a supporting position. I'm there to promote, not just to serve my constituents, but also to promote policies that work for all Vermont citizens, not just those who have access or wealth. And I think it's important to keep in touch with my community. So I make it a point to write an article almost every week while the legislature's in session in our local newspapers.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. I'll start with you this time, Mike. What will be the impact for people of your district or the state as a whole because you are reelected to the position?
So I'm going to continue working for responsive state government for all of my constituents. I'm personally responsive to my constituents by answering their emails, phone calls, engaging in conversations, and in community organizations. I'm currently serving on the, I'm currently part of the Charlotte Community Partners, which is a group that kind of organized when COVID-19 started up this year. And its purpose is to try to help our Charlotte community members in whatever their needs are during this pandemic. I believe in communication. I believe it's a two-way street, and that's why I write the articles. I try to let people know what's going on in the legislature, and sometimes it's an opinion piece where I do a little didactic exposition on my own. So the impact I hope to have is to do good things for Charlotters and for Vermont as a whole.
Thank you. Same question to you, Jessica. What will the impact be for your constituents and the state?
I'd first like to just say that I agree with Mike. Constituent service for me is the most rewarding part of this job, is being able to help those in Shelburne and St. George and others around the state to deal with state government and the state administration. How do you get your questions answered? How do you know what happens when your unemployment is not going through? Who do you talk to when you get a machine on a regular basis? Or I helped on the dog park committee because we had to move our dog park due to environmental concerns of it being on a wetland. And what we found is that they didn't really have to move it. They just had to make some changes. And so helping them to see through sort of the morass of government has always been something that at the end of the day, you feel better about. So that's for sure that I'm here and I try to get out there. I also write an article every week for the Shelburne newspaper, and I also send it to the Williston paper because most of my St. George folks like to read the Williston paper. And also I am a member of the House Human Services Committee, and we work on matters that are related to childcare, public health, and social and economic security. And so really the safety net that many people are concerned that they can slip through. And so some of the things that I hope to focus on this year are things like childcare access, older Vermonters, toxics in our environment that are impacting our kids on their toys and in our the food that we purchase, and then also government accountability. And I'm on a joint committee that's both Senate and House members, and we look at performance of our government. Is it performing well? And those issues are also incredibly important to me.
You know, I wanted to ask about your priorities for the next biennium, which you started to touch on. What's the most important piece of legislation you think the House could be working on now, and why?
Well, to me, that's an easy one. I think you were going to go to me next, right? Sorry.
Yes. Yes.
Jump in there. I really think we missed the boat by not overriding the veto for paid leave. Paid leave, to me, if we'd had paid leave as long as Rhode Island, for example, has had paid leave, they call it short-term disability in Rhode Island, and they've had it since the 60s. And I grew up in Rhode Island, and when something goes wrong in your family that you're not able to work, it happened in my family. My dad died when I was a little girl, and my mom had a nervous breakdown afterwards. And if it hadn't been for that paid leave, we would have lost our home. And so that is why I fought really hard for paid leave, because I think that it is so important to have that safety net. And we saw that with COVID. A lot of people couldn't get their unemployment quick enough. Others maybe just were in between jobs, so they couldn't jump right on. And if we'd had a paid leave program, at least it would have helped us out for a little bit and helped people feel calmer, less anxiety around those issues. And so I think that that's really important piece of legislation. I'm also really concerned about the economics right now and what's going to happen as we come back out of COVID, and how much longer are we going to go on before we have a vaccine for Vermont? I mean, it's clear that we haven't had a big problem with COVID, so we may not be first on the list to get a vaccine. So we're going to be struggling with some of these issues. And I think that when we get back to Montpelier, if we go back to Montpelier or if we're back on Zoom, that we're going to have to look at how do we help businesses? How do we help the hospitality industry, the restaurants, the wedding planners, and all of those things. And then also, how do we attract more people here? So things like broadband and childcare are going to be really important. Thanks.
Thank you. And same question to you, Mike. What are your priorities for the biennium and the most important legislation you'd like to see?
So I think the most important priority is to help people who are currently impacted by the pandemic. I think that there's going to be another congressional aid package. I don't know how much whether it's going to be a lot or just a little, depending on the results of the election, I'm not sure. But I think something is going to come our way, and we're going to have to figure out where the real needs are and how we're going to help our fellow Vermonters continue to get through this. The second priority is to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. We passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, which created a climate council, which will, with 23 members from government, from businesses, from environmental organizations, and plain old citizens, including the agricultural community. They're going to try to come up with a plan to help us reduce our carbon emissions. So as a result of those recommendations, we're going to have to probably work on some legislation to implement them. So that's going to be a real major policy goal. We also have to, we know what's been happening in terms of racial justice over the summer, and we have to address that. We've made some good strides with some of the bills we passed that will reform police training and redefine what permissible uses of force are. We need to continue taking a look at that, make sure that we recognize that we do have systemic racism in Vermont, and be careful to be anti-racist. And hold government at all levels responsible for just treatment. So those are my three priorities.
Thank you. And I actually wanted to ask about racial equity. You mentioned the legislation that has already been passed. Are you satisfied with where that's at? Do you support reparations or an apology for Vermont's role in slavery and systemic racism?
I'm satisfied with what we did at the moment. We did what we could in the amount of time that we had. I think it was a good start. We know that there's racism in Vermont. We see what happened with our former colleague, Kaya Morris, where the racial harassment that she suffered made her leave the legislature in order to protect her family. We've seen what's been going on down in the Bennington area and Pownell with, I would say, white supremacist type activity there. And we need to focus on what we can do in order to get the point across, change people's hearts and minds that we are all human beings, and every citizen of this state needs to have the same respect, regardless of our race. And so where we go from here, I'll be working with the Racial Equity Caucus, and I know Jessica is part of that too, And we will be trying to come up with responses to get rid of systemic racism in the state.
Thank you, Mike. And so same question to you, Jessica. Good to hear that you are also on that, that committee. Are you satisfied with the legislation so far? Do you support reparations or an apology for Vermont's role in systemic racism?
I agree with Mike on just everything that he just said. I mean, this work is a beginning. We have so much more work to do. And I am supportive of apologizing, to be honest. And I think that Vermonters, as I talk to people throughout my district, that they care deeply about justice and equality. And in this time of national outcry for racial justice, we are hearing this loud and clear from our constituents, and we're trying our best to listen and make some good decisions as we move forward. It's important, I think, that we also really think through what we're hearing and do this in an iterative process that is very thoughtful. From the beginnings of our history as a state, we recognized the deep injustices of our nation's foundings, becoming the first state to abolish slavery. And something that's near and dear to me is the changes to help the Abenakis, who have also endured discrimination over the years. And Chief Don Stevens, who's the chief of the Abenakis, happens to live in my district. And so over the last 4 years, we have worked together on a lot of pieces of legislation. And this year especially, we were able to get H716 through, which is I was one of the original sponsors, and it'll allow the Abenaki people hunting and fishing licenses free of charge. This is something that was promised to the Native Americans in the past treaties, but often it was forgotten. And I worked with my colleagues, Representative China and Representative Webb, and to make this happen. And we were successful in getting another bill through that's helping to change some of the road signs so that the Abenaki name is included with the English name, so that we're also doing more in education. And I also worked with Representative Stevens to present more Abenaki material, both at our State House and at our airport, so that our young people are learning. And I think we need to do that across the board. I think that there are many communities that live in our state, and we need to make sure that we're talking about their cultures and all of.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks.
Just want to take a moment for viewers. You are watching Town Meeting TV Candidates Forum for Chittenden State Representative Districts 4-1 and 5-2. If you're watching live, give us a call at 802-862-3966 and ask your question of the candidates. Watch Town Meeting TV election coverage at www.ch17.tv. Let's move on to healthcare. You know, we were just talking about racial equity. The increasing cost of healthcare has been putting pressure on Vermonters in the state economy for a while, and COVID has sharpened our focus on inequities in healthcare. What is next for healthcare changes in Vermont? Please be specific. I will start with you, Mike.
Okay, so the specific part of that question is a little daunting for me because I'm not involved in that aspect of policy making. But there was a bill that was introduced during this past biennium that would have provided a guaranteed primary care for all Vermonters. What I understand is that basic primary care, well patient visits and that sort of thing, amounts to about 7% of our total healthcare costs. So that's a piece that should be doable, and I'd like to see us move forward on that. I also think it depends a lot on what happens with the Affordable Care Act. Right now, there's a case before the Supreme Court. If the Affordable Care Act is struck down by the Supreme Court, then I think we need to reconsider single payer. That was kind of aborted during the Shumlin administration when it turned out that the payroll tax to support that would be pretty high, I think in the percent range. But I don't think that we really looked at how much would be saved in terms of the premiums that would be displaced by that. So I think we should be able to go back to that and take another look and see what happens.
Thank you. Jessica, your
Thank
thoughts on what's next for healthcare in Vermont?
Sure. I did work on healthcare. That was one of my issue areas when I worked for Senator Jeffords. And even back then, that was in the 90s, we were talking about healthcare reform, and he had a proposal called MediCore, which would have been expanding Medicare to everyone and paying for it through our FICA, through our federal taxes, and would have spread the costs out. And I believed in that as well. I think now we've moved to a further in our thinking and looking at not having our state or our insurance companies maybe run the system, but rather our providers. And I would say that we need to continue statewide efforts to move away from fee-for-service reimbursement into a system where providers are paid to provide care for a population of Vermonters. And this is called capitation and provides incentives for providers of care to be accountable for the quality and cost of the services. So making sure that quality is high. The state of Vermont has contracted with our CMS, which is the Medicare folks out of for our region. And we are in a 5-year demonstration project right now where all payers, Vermont Medicaid, Medicare, and commercial, so like Blue Cross Blue Shield and MVP, they're all agreeing to pay a fixed amount to a network of providers. And the annual growth of these payments is controlled and slower than the growth in a fee-for-service system. It's what we hear everybody call the bending of the cost curve. This all goes by the name all-payer model. And we are 3 years into this program. Remember, I said that it's a 5-year program. This all goes by I would say that the right thing to do is to complete the program, review it, analyze it, look at the data and the results. How's the quality and the cost, and then build off our experience as to what is the next step.
Thank you. I appreciate the specificity there. I'm going to start with you next, Jessica. I want to ask about education. So the legislature has impact on how education is funded statewide. Do you see a need for changes in how we fund education? How would you use your office to move any changes forward?
That's a great question. When I thought about education actually in preparing for today, I thought, oh, this is a good, hard question. I think that the legislature can make impacts on how education is funded statewide. I also think it's important for us to keep in mind that we need to distinguish between education spending and education finance. The amount of money that's spent on education is set at the local level, while the collection of the funds to cover those budgets is set at the state level. Spending is local, and then equitable funding is set by the state. So education funding is a perennial issue that comes before us at the legislature. Most solutions, however, do not focus on what we pay for, but who will pay for it. I think that the upcoming legislative session will focus less on long-term education funding issues and more on helping our students, our faculty, and our staff and families get through the multitude of challenges brought by the closing of school buildings due to this pandemic. This will include addressing COVID-related learning loss and unhealthy school buildings. Education funding issues this year will also likely be COVID-related, largely involve wild, unanticipated changes in school enrollment, a statistic upon which the tax rates are decided. And now there are so many more people who are keeping their kids home to homeschool. So all of those issues are going to be really important that we look at the legislature. And there's also a weighting study out there that the Senate looked at this year, but the House hasn't really looked at it yet. So that's going to be important as well. Thank you.
And Mike, same question. Do you Do you see a need for changes in our education funding, and how would you move any changes forward?
So I think the first priority is going to be making sure that kids get the instruction and resources that they need during this pandemic. So realizing that education is an expensive proposition, very labor intensive, and that's where most of the costs go. We have to, I think, well, going back to what Jessica said was divided up into the delivery of education and the financing of education. And in terms of the financing, I think over the last 10 years, we've made several changes that I think help take some of the pressure off property taxes by devoting the entire sales and use tax to the education fund, by restructuring the community college. Well, let me back up on this because it's not my area of expertise either. Restructuring. We have income sensitivity. We don't fund it with an income tax, but we do have income sensitivity, which means in terms of income, a lot of the burden is transferred to the property tax, basically, because whatever we get in the sales and use tax is one amount, and the rest has to be on the property tax, pretty much. So where we go from here, not really sure. There may be easier ways of doing it, but I think one of the things that I learned is that we can either have a simple system that's not fair, or a fair system that's very complex. And we're in the latter category right now.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time. I'd like to give you each a minute and a half to make a closing statement. I'll start with you, Mike.
Okay, well, my closing statement is we are in the middle of a pandemic. That's got to be priority number one right now. But we also have another existential crisis, and that's the climate change crisis. We have worked hard to bring some way of addressing the climate change crisis in Vermont so that we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We are the only state in New England where our greenhouse gas emissions have increased since 2005. All the rest of the states, including New Hampshire, have had reductions in their greenhouse gas emissions. We have to do our part. A lot of people say, well, Vermont's so small, we don't really matter much. And if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, who cares? But we have to take responsibility for the pollution that we are causing. And I like to compare it to donating blood. One pint of blood is not going to save a lot of lives. But if everybody contributes together, we can save lives with many pints of blood. And while Vermont is small and doesn't have a huge impact on greenhouse gases, we need to do our part because we're working with other states, we're working with the region, we're working with states across the United States, and we're working with other countries to address this crisis. And that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Jessica, a minute for your close.
I just first want to say, and I won't use my time on climate, but I agree with Mike 100%. We're on the Climate Solutions Caucus together, and it's so important that we get this advisory group together and we start putting together a very firm plan and get moving forward on that. But I also wanted to talk about just a little bit that, Vermont's 2020 legislative session has been one for the record books. Back when we convened in January, few would have guessed that the session would stretch into the longest days of the year. Even fewer would have believed that the State House would close and work would carry on from home. Not since 1857, when the second Vermont State House was reduced to smoldering rubble, have members been forced to conduct business outside of the chambers for months on end. But here we are, we did it. And now we're, here, we still have COVID to deal with. We still aren't sure exactly what's going to happen. So I really believe the biggest impact from these last 7 months has been the isolation that we're dealing with in our community and with our folks. And so we see issues around opiate addiction because people just couldn't get out. And we've noticed deaths going up. There's also so many issues of uncertainty and loneliness and fear. And I see that all of us, the three of us, as community leaders, we need to help bring people peace through joint efforts. We can all be part of a solution. And it goes right back to what I said earlier about the safety net and having paid leave, looking at broadband. How can we make sure that all of our kids have access throughout the state, no matter where they live? In St. George, there's a mountain and they have hard time getting through. And also we need to provide childcare. There was a lot more abuse during COVID because people were all locked into their small spaces and there was food insecurities. All of those issues are so important as we move into even longer uncertain times, and sort of get ready in January to move forward on how do we address these issues? How do we help these folks?
Thank you.
I think that's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Brumsted and Representative Yantachka, for your time this evening. Thank you for tuning in to Town Meeting TV's ongoing coverage of statewide and regional candidates. You can find this in more forums at www.ch17.tv. Don't forget to vote on or before November 3rd. Early voting by mail is happening now. Contact your town clerk's office, and the polls will be open November 3rd from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Thank you for watching.